All right. In our last video, we discussed how to convert real GDP and real GDP per person to another country's currency in order to be able to compare those statistics across countries. Well, we find that exchange rates maybe not the best method. Maybe we want to use the PPP method. In doing so, we see that some of the differences across nations are going to be reduced, but there's still, pretty sizable differences across countries in real GDP per capita. And so if we look at this in a map, like on a map, we see that a lot of the wealth is going to be converted is consolidated in North America, and in Australia, and in Europe to a similar degree. But then you start seeing, as we move across the country, you see that there's a little bit less wealth in Asia. There's a little bit less wealth in South America, and we're seeing a lot of wealth not being present in Africa. So we're seeing a lot of lower development in the African continent. So, there's large differences across. And if we look at this, we see that U.S. citizens are going to be 50 times as wealthy as the average, citizen in different African countries. So, when we take a look at that, we can look at that globally, and we see kind of where the wealth is concentrated across in the world. We can look at that, in a bar graph where we have the number of countries on the y-axis and the different real GDP per capita on the x-axis. And again, we see the same thing. Here we have, a lot of our African countries are further down in the distribution. As we start moving up, we start including some more Asian and Middle Eastern countries, and then we start adding in as we continue to move up the distribution. So as citizens, as we look at more wealth in the economy, we start including some more South American countries. Then once we get towards the upper end of the distribution, we start seeing where some of our richer Asian countries are, like South Korea, and then some of our Western European countries, and then starting to include some of the richest countries in the world of Australia and the US, and some of the rich Middle Eastern countries like Qatar. So, and what we're going to do here is we're going to use this graph to kind of compare how real GDP per person is correlated to real GDP per worker. Okay, so we'll do that in a later video. For now, what I want paid attention to is kind of how the distribution of the wealth is across the world, and then also how with real GDP. Remember that real GDP is a representation of overall welfare. And so, yeah, we have a little bit better measures of welfare than real GDP, such as like the Human Development Index, which is just an overall well-being measure, just like how well off are citizens in the country. But we see that there's a relatively strong correlation between real GDP per capita and welfare, meaning that as real GDP per capita increases, welfare is going to increase. Now, notice the scale on the x-axis here is a little bit skewed. It's a logarithmic scale, so it's quadrupling every so many distance. It quadruples every tick mark here, which means the real relationship between real GDP and happiness is, if it wasn't a logarithmic scale, it would look something like this, where we have the same happiness on the y-axis and real GDP per capita on the x. But the point being is there's a relatively strong correlation between real GDP and welfare across the world, which means we have a lot of less wealthy countries with really low overall welfare because they're so close to the poverty line. So we see that in some of these lower countries here. Okay. All right. Well, the question is, like, why and how did some countries become so rich and some countries remain so poor? Well, the answer to that is in understanding economic growth. And so we've seen the growth rate before, where we're taking the difference between a variable over 2 time periods. So time period, this is like time period tomorrow, and this is like time period today, or you can think of this as like the time period today, and this is the time period yesterday. We're looking at the difference over usually a year, over a one time period, and then finding it as a percentage. Well, if we rearrange the growth rate formula and we solve for tomorrow's value of a variable, so let's say tomorrow's value of real GDP, well, we can find today's value and multiply it by 1 plus the growth rate. Okay, so that's this piece here. So essentially what we're saying is, if we want to find what yt plus 1 is, what the value of real GDP is going to be tomorrow, well, let's say real GDP is 1,000 today, and our economy is growing at 3%, then our real GDP tomorrow is going to be 1,000 times 1 plus 0.03, which is going to be 1,030. Okay? And so real GDP tomorrow is going to be equal to 3% higher than it previously was, as given by the growth rate. Well, if the growth rate is constant, let's say it's constant at that 3%, well, then we can find what the value of a variable, real GDP in this case, is going to be in any time period, just the current time period. So just say yt is the value at the current time, as in today. Well, if we know our starting point, our initial value, given by what's called y naught, like the initial y initial value, or not being like 0, so it's like the starting point. Well, you can multiply this starting value by 1 plus whatever the growth rate is to the number of time periods. So we're just looking at this t. This is the number of time periods, typically years, number of time periods from time t. So basically what we're finding is t is going to equal, or the number of time periods is going to be t minus the initial value, or the initial time period. So how many years from, let me just write that, how many years from when time is, from the initial time period, time 0, to the current time period t. Okay, that is what you're measuring by this t, is how many years away. And so the reason there's so much power in economic growth is because it literally grows exponentially. And the exponential part is the number of time periods of which the growth is taking place. Okay. So let me clean this up a little bit. The number of time periods, if there's a relatively small difference in growth rates for two different countries, well, if that persists over a large amount of time, well, then those small differences are going to grow into really big differences in overall income. Okay. And so when we talk about economic growth, economic growth compounds on itself. So earlier growth leads to future growth. So it's kind of like a compound interest. If you have a savings account, you save your money, that interest compounds over time. Well, you're making interest on top of previous interest. Well, the same thing happens with economic growth, where we can see exponential growth, and it's literally in this exponent t in this formula here. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, what it looks like is growth where growth is increasing at an increasing rate. Exponential growth essentially means increasing at an increasing rate. Okay. And so why is the US so wealthy? Well, it's been growing at about a growth rate of 2% for the last 150 years, since like 1870. And so when you compare real GDP per capita in constant dollars, in $2,000, we see that, 140 years later, US citizens are 15 times as wealthy. They have 15 times as much stuff. The average American citizen has 15 times more stuff. Now, that doesn't take into account income inequality, but it just gives us like a rough estimate of how the average person is doing over time. And they're significantly doing better in 2007 in the US compared to 1870 because of this compounding economic growth. All right, so that's the power of trying to promote growth in your economy, even if it is a seemingly small increase in the growth rate. If that small increase in the growth rate subsists over long periods of time, well, then it can really lead to large changes in overall welfare in the economy. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to start taking a look at why this growth occurs, and then how we can model it to promote even greater growth in the future. Okay. All right.